Title: The Marionette's Curse. Chapter 1. Arrival at the mansion. The wind howled as Olivia turned off the narrow road, her headlights cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness that engulfed the forest. The tall, looming trees seemed to stretch towards her, their skeletal branches scraping against one another, creating a symphony of eerie creaks. The dirt path twisted and turned, and with each turn, Olivia felt herself being drawn deeper into the dark heart of nowhere, the cold fingers of fear slowly closing in. She had been on the road for nearly 3 hours, and the daylight had long since slipped away, leaving nothing but the oppressive night sky above. There were no stars, no comforting glows in the distance, just darkness pressing in from all sides. She felt small, vulnerable, as though the night was a living entity, swallowing her whole. Every so often her headlights would reveal something that made her heart leap. A shifting shadow, a flash of movement, perhaps an animal darting across the road. But each time it was gone before she could be sure. The mansion lay ahead, hidden somewhere within the vast wilderness, a forgotten relic from another time. She had only ever seen pictures, an old estate, its paint faded and its wood worn, yet standing defiant against the weight of age. It was a place that seemed trapped in its own time, one that didn't quite fit into the modern world. She had answered the job posting without much thought, a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman, isolated, but well paid. She had been eager to get away, to find solitude, but now, driving alone into the unknown, her stomach twisted with a sense of foreboding. Suddenly, the mansion appeared, its shadowy form emerging through the trees, looming tall and sinister in her headlights. The wrought-iron gate creaked open as she approached, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she made her way towards the house, the sound echoing in the silence like bones breaking. The mansion itself was massive, its windows dark and hollow, like the empty eyes of a giant face staring down at her. The front door was heavy and made of dark wood, adorned with an intricate brass knocker in the shape of a raven. It gleamed under the headlights, seeming almost alive. She parked her car and took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she turned off the ignition, and for a moment, the silence felt deafening. Olivia sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white as a sense of dread settled deep in her stomach. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that seemed to seep into her bones. Finally, she opened the door, the cool night air hitting her face as she stepped out. She paused for a moment, glancing back down the dirt path she had driven in on. The dark tunnel of trees now a void, swallowing any sign of where she had come from. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. She shook off the feeling and made her way up the front steps. Her shoes clacked against the wooden boards, the sound echoing into the empty night. She took the brass knocker in her hand, feeling its cold weight, and let it fall. The sound was loud and final, a deep, resonating thud that seemed to vibrate through the house. Moments later, the door opened with a slow creak. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from within the house. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she looked up into a face that was both old and sharp, with deep-set eyes that seemed to peer into her very soul. The woman's hair was grey, pulled back into a tight bun, and her lips were thin, almost bloodless. "You must be Olivia," the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like the whisper of dead leaves on the wind. She stepped aside, her eyes never leaving Olivia's. "Come in." Olivia hesitated, the air thick with a strange tension. But she forced herself to smile, nodding slightly as she stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind her with a loud, echoing thud, and she couldn't help but feel as though she was being sealed inside. The entryway was dimly lit, the walls lined with old portraits, each one more unsettling than the last. The faces in the paintings were stern, their eyes following her as she moved, their expressions cold and unforgiving. She had the distinct sense that she was being watched, that the house itself was aware of her presence. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in places, and the air smelled of dust and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her uneasy. "I'm Mrs. Caldwell," the woman said, her voice breaking the silence. "I care for Magda, but I am getting too old to manage on my own. She needs more attention now, more care. I hope you understand the responsibility." Olivia nodded, trying to ignore the way Mrs. Caldwell's eyes seemed to pierce her. There was something strange about the woman, something almost hollow. It was as though she were more shadow than flesh, as though the house itself had begun to absorb her over time. "Yes, of course," Olivia said, her voice sounding small and uncertain. "I understand." Mrs. Caldwell nodded, turning on her heel and gesturing for Olivia to follow. They moved down a narrow hallway, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The house was vast, its corridors stretching endlessly, the walls lined with closed doors that seemed to whisper as they passed. Olivia couldn't help but wonder what lay behind those doors, what secrets the house held in its dark corners. They finally reached a room at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and Mrs. Caldwell pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space. An elderly woman sat in an armchair by the window, her back to them. Her hair was thin and white, her frame frail and bent. She didn't turn as they entered, her gaze fixed on something outside, beyond the darkened glass. "Magda, this is Olivia," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice softer now, almost tender. "She's here to help." The woman in the chair didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. Mrs. Caldwell glanced at Olivia, her eyes narrowing slightly. "She doesn't speak much anymore," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But she understands. She knows." Olivia nodded, her eyes lingering on the old woman's frail form. There was something unsettling about her stillness, the way she seemed to be lost in her own world, disconnected from everything around her. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and Olivia felt a sense of unease settle deep in her chest. Mrs. Caldwell turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "You'll stay in the room next door," she said, her voice echoing faintly down the corridor. "If you need anything, I'll be in the attic." Olivia watched as the door closed behind her, leaving her alone with Magda. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer, darker. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes scanning the room. It was sparsely furnished. A bed, a dresser, and a small table with a lamp that cast a dim, flickering light. But it was the marionette on the shelf that caught her eye. It was old, its paint chipped and faded, its strings tangled and knotted. Its face was painted with a grotesque smile, its eyes wide and staring. Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat as she looked at it, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. There was something wrong about it, something that made her stomach turn. She tore her gaze away, forcing herself to focus on Magda. She moved closer, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and knelt beside the old woman's chair. "Magda," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Magda didn't move, her eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Olivia followed her gaze, but all she saw was her own reflection staring back at her, her face pale and frightened. "Magda," she tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm here to help you." Slowly, Magda turned her head, her eyes meeting Olivia's. They were dark, empty, filled with something that made Olivia's blood run cold. And then, without a word, Magda lifted her hand, her thin fingers pointing towards the marionette on the shelf. Olivia felt her stomach drop, her eyes drawn back to the puppet. It seemed to be watching her, its painted smile mocking, its eyes filled with malice. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows closing in, and for a brief moment, Olivia felt as though she were no longer alone, as though something else were there with them, hiding in the darkness, waiting. Magda's hand fell back to her lap, her gaze returning to the window as though nothing had happened. Olivia stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the marionette. She took a step back, the floorboards creaking beneath her, and turned towards the door. She needed to leave, to get out of that room, away from the cold, empty eyes of the puppet. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling, and pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was dark, the light from the lamp barely reaching the walls, and she stepped out, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. As she closed the door behind her, she could have sworn she heard a faint sound from within, a soft, hollow laugh, like the creak of old wood, echoing through the silence. She turned away, her heart pounding, and hurried down the hall, the shadows seeming to reach for her as she went. She didn't look back. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark. The next morning, Olivia woke to the dim light filtering through the heavy, dusty curtains. The room was cold, the air carrying that strange smell again. Sweet, almost decaying, like something left too long to wither. She shivered as she climbed out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and she rubbed her arms to ward off the chill. It had been a fitful night, her dreams filled with shadows and whispers she couldn't quite remember, yet they left her feeling drained. She glanced at her watch. It was just past 6. She had always been an early riser, but this place made her question even the simplest of habits. A strange discomfort settled into her chest as she looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the faded wallpaper and the old dresser against the wall. There was a mirror hanging above the dresser, its surface smudged and cracked at the edges. Her reflection stared back at her, looking paler than she remembered, her eyes wide and filled with something she couldn't name. Fear, maybe. Olivia dressed quickly, pulling on a thick sweater to guard against the morning chill. She opened the door slowly, wincing at the creak that echoed through the hallway. The house was silent, as though holding its breath, and she hesitated before stepping out, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. She made her way down the hallway, her footsteps muffled against the thick carpet, and descended the staircase. The old house groaned around her, as though resenting her presence, and she found herself holding her breath as she reached the bottom of the stairs. She didn't want to wake anyone. Mrs. Caldwell or Magda. She wanted time to herself, to think, to process the unease that had settled into her bones. The kitchen was as she remembered it from last night, dimly lit and cold, with the same strange smell lingering in the air. She found the kettle on the stove and filled it with water, placing it on the burner and lighting the flame. The gas hissed for a moment before catching, the flame flickering weakly. She watched the water begin to boil, her mind drifting back to the events of the previous night. The strange stillness in Magda's room, the Marionette's cold eyes, the way the shadows seemed to reach for her in the hallway. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. There was something wrong about this place. It wasn't just old. It felt haunted, not by ghosts, not in the way she'd heard of in stories. It was something deeper, something that seemed to live in the very walls, a darkness that had soaked into the wood, into the very bones of the house. The kettle whistled, breaking her reverie. She turned off the flame and poured the water into a chipped mug, stirring in a spoonful of instant coffee. The warmth of the mug was comforting, and she stood for a moment, cradling it in her hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Suddenly, she heard something soft, barely audible, like a faint whisper. She froze, her eyes darting to the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The whisper grew louder, a hissing sound that seemed to echo through the kitchen, bouncing off the walls, filling the space around her. Olivia, her name, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and entirely foreign. Her stomach lurched, and she turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The kitchen was empty, the hallway beyond dark and still. She felt a chill run down her spine, and she took a step back, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing. She shook her head, trying to dispel the fear that clung to her. It was just her imagination. The house was old. It creaked. It groaned. It was nothing more than that. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something else here, something watching, something waiting. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move, to break free of the fear that had taken hold of her. She stepped out into the hallway, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, her ears straining for any sound. The whisper had stopped, but the sense of being watched hadn't left her. She made her way to Magda's room, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The door was closed, but she could see a faint sliver of light shining from beneath it. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to open the door, didn't want to see what waited for her on the other side, but she had a job to do. Slowly, she turned the knob, the door creaking as it opened. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, the air cold and thick. Magda sat in her armchair, her eyes fixed on the window, her body still and rigid. The marionette was still on the shelf, its head tilted slightly, its eyes staring down at her, as if mocking her fear. "Good morning, Magda," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, no movement from the old woman. She simply sat there, her eyes empty, her face expressionless. Olivia swallowed, stepping further into the room, her eyes drawn once more to the marionette. It looked different today, its smile wider, its eyes darker. It felt alive, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She tore her eyes away, focusing instead on Magda. "Would you like some breakfast?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Magda turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Olivia's. For a moment, Olivia thought she saw something in them. A flicker of recognition, a spark of something human. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only emptiness behind. Olivia nodded, forcing herself to smile. "I'll get you something to eat," she said softly. She turned to leave the room, but as she did, she heard it again. A faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Olivia." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was closer now, louder, more insistent. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the source. The marionette stared back at her, its smile twisted, its eyes gleaming. The whisper grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She clamped her hands over her ears, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes wide with fear. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped. Olivia lowered her hands slowly, her eyes still fixed on the marionette. It hadn't moved, but she could feel it watching her, feel its presence pressing down on her. A dark weight that seemed to seep into her bones. She backed out of the room, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the silent hallway, and leaned against it, her eyes closed, her body shaking. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening in this house. What was happening to Magda? She needed to know why the marionette seemed to watch her, why it seemed to know her name. But most of all, she needed to get out. And yet she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood. Not until she knew what was waiting for her in the shadows. She took a deep breath, pushing herself away from the door, her eyes scanning the dark hallway. The house was silent once more, the shadows still, but the sense of being watched lingered, a constant, oppressive presence that weighed down on her. She needed to find Mrs. Caldwell. She needed to understand what was happening, why the house seemed alive, why it seemed to know her. She made her way towards the stairs, her footsteps slow, cautious, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The attic. Mrs. Caldwell had said she would be in the attic. Olivia hesitated at the foot of the stairs, her eyes travelling up the narrow steps. The attic door was at the very top, slightly ajar, a faint light shining from within. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, the light from the attic flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. When she reached the top, she hesitated, her hand resting on the door. She could hear something. Movement. A faint rustling, as though someone were shifting through old papers. Or perhaps whispering. She pushed the door open slowly, her eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. The attic was cluttered, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and strange, forgotten relics. But in the center of the room stood Mrs. Caldwell, her back to Olivia, her hands moving in strange, jerky motions, as though she were manipulating something just out of sight. "Mrs. Caldwell." Olivia's voice trembled as she stepped into the room. Mrs. Caldwell froze, her head turning slowly, her eyes meeting Olivia's. They were dark, hollow, filled with something that made Olivia's blood run cold. "Olivia," Mrs. Caldwell whispered, her voice low, almost a hiss. She took a step towards Olivia, her movements unnatural, as though she were being controlled by invisible strings. Olivia took a step back, her heart pounding, her eyes darting to the object in Mrs. Caldwell's hands, a marionette, its eyes wide, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The same smile as the one on Magda's shelf. And then, the whisper returned. Louder this time, echoing in Olivia's mind, drowning out everything else. Play with me, Olivia. The attic seemed to spin, the shadows closing in, the air growing colder, thicker, until she could barely breathe. The marionette's eyes seemed to follow her, its smile growing wider, more twisted. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty house, the whisper chasing her, following her, filling her mind with darkness. And in that moment, she knew. There was no escaping it. The marionette was alive, and it wanted her. Chapter 3. The Puppeteer's Song. The morning came reluctantly, shrouded in a veil of fog that clung to the windows like a desperate ghost. Olivia woke in a haze, her head aching, her memories of the previous day feeling like fragments of a nightmare. The events in the attic replayed in her mind, a blur of whispers, shadows, and the marionette's twisted smile. She could still hear Mrs. Caldwell's voice, the strange, almost mechanical way she had said her name. She shivered, trying to shake off the sense of dread that lingered in her bones. She dressed quickly, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her shirt. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and she had the distinct feeling that she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows seeming to shift and move just beyond her vision. She turned towards the dresser, her eyes catching her own reflection in the cracked mirror. She looked different, paler, her eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. She tore her gaze away, unable to bear the sight. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening in this house, why the marionette seemed to have a hold on everyone around her. She had to find Mrs. Caldwell, confront her, demand the truth. But deep down, she was terrified of what she might learn. Olivia stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. She could feel the darkness pressing in around her, a presence that seemed to seep from the very walls. As she made her way towards the stairs, she heard it again, a faint, almost melodic humming. The sound was coming from Magda's room, the same haunting tune she had heard in her dreams. She paused, her hand resting on the banister, her heart pounding in her chest. The tune was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It was like something from her childhood, a distant memory that had been twisted into something dark and unnatural. She moved towards Magda's room, her footsteps careful, silent, as if she were afraid of being caught. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see the old woman sitting in her armchair, her back to Olivia. The marionette was in her lap, its head tilted, its eyes staring directly at the door. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the humming grew louder, more insistent, the tune twisting into a discordant melody that made her stomach turn. "Magda," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. The humming stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Magda didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. The marionette, however, seemed to shift, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Olivia took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Magda, are you all right?" Slowly, Magda turned her head, her eyes meeting Olivia's. They were dark, empty, filled with something that made Olivia's skin crawl. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, just a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. Olivia felt her blood run cold as Magda's hand moved, her fingers wrapping around the marionette's strings, pulling them tight. The marionette's head jerked, its smile widening, its eyes locking onto Olivia's. She took a step back, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on the puppet. It moved, its limbs twitching as if struggling against invisible bonds, its strings pulled taut by Magda's shaking hands. "Play!" Magda's voice was a whisper, her lips barely moving. "Play with me, Olivia." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the marionette. It felt alive, its presence filling the room, pressing down on her. making it hard to breathe. "Magda, I can't," Olivia stammered, her voice breaking. "I don't understand." Magda's eyes narrowed, her grip on the strings tightening, the marionette's limbs jerking violently. The air in the room grew colder, the light dimming, as if the house itself were reacting to Magda's anger. Olivia could feel the pressure building, a dark force that seemed to wrap around her, pulling her towards the puppet. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the empty house, her heart racing, her mind filled with the twisted melody of Magda's humming. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows shifting and writhing, reaching for her as she ran. She stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She needed to get out, needed to escape the oppressive darkness that seemed to fill every corner of the house. She burst into the kitchen, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape. The back door. She ran to it, her hands fumbling with the lock, her fingers trembling. The door swung open and she stumbled outside, the cold morning air hitting her face like a slap. She gasped, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned, looking back at the house. It loomed above her, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring down at her. The marionette's twisted smile seemed to be etched into the very walls, mocking her fear, her desperation. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the edge of the woods. The trees were thick, their branches bare, reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was still, the world around her unnaturally quiet, as if the house had swallowed all sound, all life. Suddenly, she heard it, a soft rustling coming from the edge of the woods. Her eyes darted towards the sound, her heart skipping a beat. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, its form obscured by the shadows. It was tall, thin, its limbs long and awkward, like a puppet on strings. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if pulled by invisible hands. Its head tilted to one side, and she could see its eyes, dark, hollow, staring directly at her. "Olivia!" The whisper was soft, barely audible, but it seemed to echo through the stillness, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold ground, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The world around her seemed to blur, the trees blending together, the shadows closing in. She didn't stop until she reached the road, her chest burning, her legs trembling. She collapsed to her knees, her hands gripping the cold asphalt, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The whisper still echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that seemed to follow her, no matter how far she ran. She looked back towards the mansion, its silhouette barely visible through the thick fog. The figure was gone, but she could still feel its presence, could still hear the soft rustling of its strings, the faint echo of Magda's twisted melody. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from this place, from the darkness that seemed to cling to every corner, every shadow. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood. Not until she knew what the marionette wanted. She pushed herself to her feet, her body shaking, her mind filled with a growing sense of dread. She needed answers, and there was only one place left to look. The attic. She turned back towards the house, her heart pounding, her hands clenched into fists. She had to face whatever was waiting for her in the shadows, whatever was hiding in the darkness. She had to know the truth, and she had to do it before the marionette took control of her, just as it had taken control of Magda. She made her way back to the house, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The door stood open, the darkness inside seeming to reach for her, inviting her in. She took a deep breath, stepping over the threshold, her eyes scanning the shadows. The house was silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. She could feel the weight of the marionette's presence, the darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls, wrapping around her, pulling her in. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The attic door was at the top, slightly ajar, the faint light from within flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding, her eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. The attic was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to move, to shift, just beyond her vision. The marionette hung from the rafters, its strings tangled, its head tilted to one side, its eyes staring down at her. Mrs. Caldwell stood beneath it, her hands moving in strange, jerky motions, as though she were pulling the strings, her eyes wide, empty, filled with something that made Olivia's skin crawl. "Play with me, Olivia." Mrs. Caldwell's voice was soft, almost a whisper, her lips barely moving. The marionette jerked, its limbs moving, its strings pulled taut. Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat, her body frozen in place, her eyes locked on the puppet. The air grew colder, the light dimming, the darkness closing in, pressing down on her, wrapping around her. She could feel the marionette's presence, could hear its whisper in her mind, a haunting melody that twisted and turned, filling her thoughts, drowning out everything else. "Play with me." The whisper grew louder, more insistent, the darkness pressing closer, suffocating her. Olivia took a step back, her heart pounding, her eyes wide with fear. But there was nowhere to go. The marionette's eyes seemed to glow, its smile widening, its strings tightening, pulling her towards it, pulling her into the darkness. And Olivia knew with a sinking sense of dread that there was no escaping it. The marionette had chosen her, and the game had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Marionette's Embrace. The cold seemed more intense now, more insistent, gnawing at Olivia's skin as if the air itself carried an unseen, chilling malevolence. She took one hesitant step into the attic, the room seeming to pull her in like a dark tide. She tried to focus, to understand what she was seeing, but everything felt out of place, wrong, like reality itself had twisted and become a nightmarish echo of what should be. The marionette hung from the rafters, its strings tangled in what looked like spiderwebs. Its head swiveled slowly to face her, and its grin widened. It was almost like a grotesque joke, an evil mimicry of cheer. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pulse with an awareness that sent shivers down Olivia's spine. Mrs. Caldwell stood beneath it, her fingers wrapped around the marionette's strings, pulling at them with jerky, erratic movements. Her face was empty, her eyes blank, her mouth hanging open slightly, as if she had forgotten what it was like to breathe, to be human. "Olivia," Mrs. Caldwell whispered, her voice soft but unmistakably eerie. "We are waiting." The words seemed to echo in the attic, bouncing off the walls, distorting themselves. The shadows moved with the words, swirling in the corners of the attic as if they were listening too. Olivia felt her heart pounding in her ears, her breath quickening as her fight-or-flight instinct screamed at her to run. Yet she stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the need to understand what was happening. The marionette's head tilted to one side, its movement so unnatural, it looked like something inhuman, like a living wooden skeleton. It started to laugh, a sound so hollow it echoed as if from deep inside the earth, resonating through the air, vibrating inside Olivia's chest. The strings began to jerk, and the marionette's arms moved, first one, then the other, lifting as if beckoning to her. "Come closer, Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice now distant, almost as if she was speaking from a place far away, a place that was not entirely of this world. Olivia shook her head, her throat tightening. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell Mrs. Caldwell to stop, to let go of the strings, but the words were trapped, lodged deep inside her chest. Her legs felt heavy, almost as though something had wrapped around them, anchoring her to the spot. Suddenly, the marionette lunged towards her. Its body swung forward as if something had violently yanked on its strings. Its wooden hand reached out, and Olivia instinctively stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the dusty attic floor. She fell, her back slamming against an old chest, sending pain shooting up her spine. The marionette's fingers brushed her face, cold, splintered wood grazing her cheek. Olivia's vision blurred as tears welled up, the sense of dread tightening around her like a vice. She felt herself start to tremble, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts as she pushed herself away, scrambling across the floor. The marionette's laugh grew louder, the hollow sound reverberating in her skull, drowning out every rational thought. She needed to get out, needed to escape this nightmare before it swallowed her whole. She looked around frantically, her eyes searching for anything, any way out. But all she saw were shadows, growing darker, more solid, pressing in from every corner of the attic. Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the laughter, sharp and commanding. "Do not run, Olivia. The game has begun. You must play." Olivia's hands found something solid, something heavy, an old candlestick, its brass surface cold and smooth. Without thinking, she swung it at the marionette, the metal connecting with a sickening crack. The marionette jerked back, its body twisting, the strings snapping, its laughter turning into a shrill scream that pierced the air. The attic seemed to shudder, the walls trembling, the shadows recoiling as if wounded. Olivia pushed herself to her feet, her body shaking, her eyes locked on the marionette. It lay on the floor, its limbs twisted, its head at an unnatural angle, but its eyes still watched her, the grin still plastered across its face. Mrs. Caldwell let out a low moan, her fingers releasing the strings, her body sagging, her head lolling forward. Olivia rushed towards her, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Caldwell," she shouted, her voice cracking. She grabbed the old woman's shoulders, shaking her gently. "Wake up, please, wake up." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they seemed clear, free of the darkness that had consumed them. She looked at Olivia, her lips moving as if trying to form words. Finally, she managed to whisper, her voice so faint that Olivia had to lean in to hear her. "You must end it. The puppet." Her eyes rolled back, her body going limp in Olivia's arms. Olivia's heart pounded, her mind reeling. End it? How? She looked at the marionette, its twisted form lying motionless on the attic floor. The shadows seemed to stir, as if they were watching, waiting for her to make a move. She stood, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the marionette. It felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just a puppet. It was something more, something dark, something alive. And it was tied to this house, to Mrs. Caldwell, to Magda, and now, to her. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the attic. There had to be something here, something that could help her end this nightmare. She moved towards the old chest she had fallen against, her fingers brushing the dusty surface. She opened it, the hinges creaking, the scent of decay wafting up from within. Inside, she found old books, their covers worn and cracked. She picked one up, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The writing was faded, the ink smudged, but she could make out some of the words. Words about rituals, about binding spirits, about controlling them. She looked at the marionette, her stomach turning. Was that what this was? Some kind of binding? Had someone bound a spirit to the puppet, trapping it, forcing it to do their bidding? The thought made her skin crawl, but it also gave her hope. If the spirit had been bound, maybe she could find a way to break the binding, to free it, and in doing so, free herself, free Magda, free Mrs. Caldwell. She flipped through the book, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding. She found a passage about breaking bindings, about severing the connection between the spirit and the object it was bound to. It spoke of fire, of salt, of breaking the object that held the spirit. Olivia looked at the marionette, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do. She grabbed the candlestick, her fingers tightening around the cold metal. She moved towards the marionette, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shadows seemed to swirl around her, whispering, pleading, but she ignored them. She brought the candlestick down on the marionette, the metal connecting with the wood with a sickening crack. The marionette jerked, its limbs twitching, its eyes widening. The shadows around her shrieked, the sound deafening, echoing through the attic. She hit it again and again, each blow sending splinters flying, each crack echoing in her ears. The marionette's grin twisted, its eyes narrowing, the darkness within them seeming to seep out, spreading across the floor, reaching for her. Olivia stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She grabbed the book, her eyes scanning the passage. Fire. She needed fire. She looked around the attic, her eyes falling on an old oil lamp, its glass surface dusty and cracked. She grabbed it, her hands trembling as she unscrewed the top, pouring the oil over the marionette, the scent filling the air, making her gag. The shadows seemed to recoil, the darkness growing thinner, the whispers turning into screams. Olivia struck a match, the flame flickering, casting long shadows across the attic. She dropped the match onto the marionette, the flames leaping up, consuming the wood, the strings, the darkness. The marionette let out a high-pitched scream, its body writhing, the shadows around it twisting, writhing, until finally they began to dissolve, to fade, the darkness lifting. Olivia watched, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The marionette's body crumbled, the wood turning to ash, the strings disintegrating, the darkness disappearing. The attic fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the flames, the scent of smoke filling the air. Olivia fell to her knees, her body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. The marionette was gone. The darkness was gone. She looked at Mrs. Caldwell, her heart sinking as she saw the old woman lying motionless on the floor. She crawled towards her, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. Nothing. Tears filled Olivia's eyes, her heart aching. She had done what she had to do, what Mrs. Caldwell had told her to do. But it had cost her. It had cost them all. She took a deep breath, wiping her tears, her eyes scanning the attic. The shadows were gone. The darkness lifted. But the sense of loss remained, a heavy weight in her chest. She stood, her body aching, her mind numb. She had to leave, had to get out of this house, away from the memories, away from the darkness. She turned, her eyes catching on something in the corner of the attic. A small marionette, its eyes dark, its smile twisted. Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat, her body frozen. The marionette's head tilted. Play with me. Olivia in Demented Marionette. A live-in caregiver named Cheryl experiences a series of disturbing supernatural events while caring for an elderly woman, Magdalene. Cheryl becomes increasingly paranoid as she encounters unsettling footage of someone moving like a marionette and faces strange occurrences around the house. Magdalene's behavior also becomes increasingly unsettling, leading Cheryl to question her own sanity. The story weaves psychological and supernatural horror to blur the line between reality and delusion. Chapter 5. The Hollow Strings. The wind howled around the house that night, an angry, restless sound that seemed to want to tear down the walls. Olivia had locked herself in her room, the door barricaded with whatever furniture she could move. Her breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling with every tremor that racked her body. Her eyes were swollen, her fingers sore from gripping her makeshift weapon, an old iron poker she'd found beside the fireplace downstairs. Everything felt surreal, as though she were trapped in a nightmare she could not wake up from. She thought back to Mrs. Caldwell's vacant eyes, her body limp on the attic floor. The marionette had seemed to be destroyed, yet it persisted, its grotesque visage lurking in the corner of her mind. She tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of her imagination, that the horrors she saw were nothing more than trauma's scars playing upon her senses. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't over. The puppet had not let her go. Outside her room, the hallways groaned, the house shifting as if something moved through it. Every little sound, the rattle of a window, the creak of a floorboard, felt like an approaching menace. Shadows danced across the walls, their shapes twisting into grotesque figures that seemed to reach for her. She clenched her jaw, shaking her head as she muttered to herself, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But her voice was shaky, betraying the fear that gripped her heart. Suddenly, there was a knock on her door. A soft, deliberate tapping that sent her heart into her throat. She held her breath, her body tensing, her fingers tightening around the iron poker. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a faint voice, a whisper that chilled her to her bones. "Olivia, let me in." It was Magda's voice, her tone almost pleading, but there was something off about it. The cadence was wrong, the words slightly slurred, as though someone, or something, were mimicking her. Olivia's body shook, her eyes wide as she stared at the door. She could see the shadows beneath it shifting, something moving just outside her room. She bit her lip, trying to stay quiet, to steady her breathing. But her heart was pounding so loudly, she was certain whatever was out there could hear it. "Olivia!" The voice whispered again, more insistent, the door handle rattling slightly. "Please, let me in." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling as she shook her head. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not her. You're not Magda." The whispering stopped, the silence that followed even more terrifying. The shadows beneath the door were still, and for a moment, she thought it was over, that whatever had come for her had given up. But then, the handle turned, the door shaking as if something were throwing its full weight against it. Olivia screamed, backing away, the iron poker held out in front of her like a shield. The door rattled violently, the wood creaking, the whispers rising into a chorus of voices, each one more twisted, more desperate than the last. "Play with us, Olivia. Let us in." The voices seemed to echo, coming from every direction, surrounding her, pressing down on her. She stumbled backward, her body colliding with the dresser, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. The light flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and Olivia felt her blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, thin silhouette, its limbs long and twisted, its head tilted to one side. The figure took a step into the room, and in the faint light from the window, Olivia saw its face. Painted, grotesque, a twisted mockery of a human smile, the Marionette. Olivia let out a choked sob, her body frozen in terror, as the Marionette moved closer, its limbs jerking awkwardly, as though pulled by invisible strings. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and its smile seemed to widen, its teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Play with me, Olivia," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to fill her mind, drowning out her thoughts. Olivia's heart pounded, her hands trembling as she gripped the iron poker. She had to fight. She had to end this. She lunged forward, swinging the poker with all her strength, the metal connecting with the Marionette's head with a sickening crack. The Marionette staggered back, its body twisting, but it didn't fall. It straightened, its head jerking back into place, its hollow eyes staring at her, unblinking. Olivia let out a scream, swinging the poker again and again, each blow sending splinters flying, each impact echoing in the darkness. But no matter how many times she hit it, the Marionette kept coming, its limbs jerking, its smile never faltering. She stumbled back, her body hitting the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Marionette moved closer, its arms outstretched, its fingers reaching for her, cold and unyielding. She felt the air grow colder, the shadows around her thickening, closing in, as if the very darkness of the room were coming to life. Suddenly, Olivia remembered the book she had found in the attic, the passage about bindings, about breaking the connection between the spirit and the object. She needed fire. She needed to burn it. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the remnants of the shattered lamp. The oil had spilled across the floor, the glass shards glinting in the faint light. She lunged for it, her fingers scraping against the floor as she grabbed a piece of the broken lamp, her hands trembling. The Marionette's fingers brushed against her arm, cold as death, and she let out a scream, twisting away, her heart pounding in her chest. She struck a match, her breath catching as the flame flickered to life, the light casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The Marionette paused, its hollow eyes staring at the flame, its smile faltering for the first time. Olivia's hands shook as she dropped the match onto the oil-soaked floor, the fire springing to life, the flames leaping up, consuming the Marionette, the darkness. The Marionette let out a high-pitched scream, its body writhing, the shadows around it twisting, recoiling. The flames grew higher, the heat searing, the smoke filling the room, choking her. But she didn't look away. She watched as the Marionette's body twisted and crumbled, the wood turning to ash, the strings disintegrating, the darkness lifting. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the flames, the scent of smoke filling the air. Olivia collapsed to her knees, her body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. The Marionette was gone. But as she looked around the room, her eyes catching on the shadows still lingering in the corners, she knew it wasn't truly over. The darkness was still there, watching, waiting. She needed to leave. She pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, her mind numb. She stumbled out of the room, her eyes scanning the hallway. The house was silent, the air thick with the scent of smoke, but the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight in her chest. She made her way to the front door, her footsteps slow, her body trembling. She had to leave, had to get away from this place, away from the darkness that seemed to cling to every corner, every shadow. But as she reached for the door, she heard it, a faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from deep within the house. Olivia? Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, the shadows shifting, moving. And then she saw it, a small marionette, its strings tangled, its eyes dark, its smile twisted. Olivia felt her blood run cold, her body frozen in place, the marionette's head tilted. "Play with me, Olivia." The whisper echoed in the darkness, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. And in that moment, she knew it would never let her go. The marionette's game was far from over, and Olivia was still its puppet. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Walls. The next morning, the air inside the mansion was stagnant and thick, as if the darkness of the previous night had lingered, wrapping itself around the walls. Olivia had managed to survive the night, but it had left her broken, trembling, and her mind haunted by the marionette's twisted whisper, its plea to play. She could still hear its voice echoing in her thoughts, crawling beneath her skin, an incessant presence that refused to leave. The sunlight filtered weakly through the tattered curtains, casting pale skeletal patterns across the floor. She pushed herself up from the chair where she had fallen asleep, her limbs stiff, her throat parched. She rubbed her eyes, trying to dispel the images of fire, the puppet's splintered wood, the smell of burning, and the hollow, mocking laughter that echoed even in the silence. It was supposed to be over. She had destroyed the marionette, burned it to ash, but as she looked around the room, she knew something was still wrong. She could feel it, a presence lurking, hiding just beyond her vision, watching her every move. The shadows seemed thicker today, heavier, and the house itself felt alive. She needed answers. Something. Anything that could help her break free of this nightmare. Mrs. Caldwell's words echoed in her mind, her plea to end it, to stop whatever was happening in this place. But she had failed, and now Mrs. Caldwell was gone. Magda was lost in her own world, and Olivia was left alone with the darkness that seemed to follow her everywhere. She stood, her knees weak, her body aching, and made her way to the kitchen. The house was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if it were holding its breath. Her footsteps echoed as she walked, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the oppressive quiet. In the kitchen, she found Magda, sitting at the table, her gaze fixed on something invisible in front of her. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her face expressionless. Olivia hesitated at the doorway, her heart aching for the old woman. She looked so fragile, so empty, just a shell of the person she might have once been. "Magda," Olivia called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning Magda's face for any sign of recognition. Magda turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Olivia's. For a moment there was nothing, no acknowledgement, no emotion. And then, her lips parted, and she whispered something, her voice so faint Olivia almost missed it. "Strings," Magda said, her voice cracking. "The strings. They're all connected." Olivia's stomach tightened, a chill creeping down her spine. She knelt beside Magda, her eyes searching the old woman's face. "What do you mean, Magda?" she asked, her voice trembling. Magda's eyes shifted, her gaze distant, unfocused. "The puppeteer, the strings, we're all connected." Her voice trailed off, her eyes glassy. as if she were seeing something far beyond the confines of the kitchen. Olivia's throat tightened, her pulse quickening. She didn't understand, but she knew Magda was trying to tell her something important. Something she needed to know if she had any hope of escaping this nightmare. "How do I stop it, Magda?" she asked, her voice urgent. "How do I cut the strings?" Magda's gaze shifted again, her eyes locking onto Olivia's, and for the briefest moment, there was something there. Fear, desperation, a plea for help. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling, but before she could speak, her body convulsed, her eyes rolling back, her hands clenching into fists. Olivia jumped back, her heart leaping into her throat. Magda let out a low, guttural moan, her body shaking, her fingers clawing at the air. Olivia grabbed her shoulders, trying to steady her, but the old woman's strength was frightening, her body twisting as if she were fighting something inside her. "Magda!" Olivia cried, her voice breaking. "Please, tell me what to do!" Magda's eyes snapped open, her gaze locking onto Olivia's, her expression twisted in pain. "The walls!" she gasped, her voice a rasp. "They whisper. Listen to the walls." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Magda's body went limp, her head slumping forward, her breathing ragged. Olivia's hands shook as she held the old woman, her mind racing. The walls. What did that mean? She gently lowered Magda back into the chair, her heart aching as she looked at the frail woman, her eyes now closed, her face pale. Olivia knew she couldn't leave her like this, but she also knew she had to find out what Magda meant. She had to understand the whispers, the strings, the connection that bound them all to this cursed house. Olivia took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the kitchen. The walls were old, the wallpaper peeling, the plaster cracked. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the surface, her ear pressed to the wall. For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence of the house, the faint creaks of the floorboards settling. And then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. A voice that seemed to come from deep within the walls, echoing through the plaster, vibrating against her skin. "Olivia!" Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as if something, or someone, were trapped within the walls, calling to her, begging for release. "Olivia, cut the strings!" Her heart pounded, her hands trembling as she stepped back, her eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to move, to pulse, as if they were alive, as if they were breathing. She could hear the whispers now, not just from the kitchen, but from every wall, every corner of the house. A chorus of voices all calling her name, all begging her to listen. "Cut the strings. Free us." The words wrapped around her, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She stumbled back, her body hitting the table, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the presence again, the darkness that seemed to live within the very bones of the house, pressing down on her, wrapping around her like a vice. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape the whispers, the darkness, the strings that seemed to pull her deeper and deeper into the nightmare. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty house, the whispers following her, growing louder, more insistent. She stumbled up the stairs, her body trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to think, needed to understand what Magda was trying to tell her. She reached the attic, her eyes scanning the dark, cluttered space. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, as if they were alive, and she could feel the weight of their gaze, watching her, waiting for her next move. In the corner of the attic she saw it, the old chest, the one where she had found the book. She moved towards it, her hands trembling as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. The book was still there. The pages yellowed. The ink faded. She flipped through it, her fingers brushing against the words, her eyes searching for anything that could help her, anything that could explain what was happening. She found a passage, the words smudged, barely legible. It spoke of a binding, of a connection between the puppeteer and the puppet, a bond that could only be broken by severing the strings that held them together. The strings were not physical. They were something deeper, something that tied the spirit of the puppet to the house, to the people within it. The whispers grew louder, the voices filling the attic, pressing in from all sides. "Cut the strings, Olivia! Free us!" She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the attic. The marionette was gone, but she could still feel its presence, could still hear its voice, its twisted plea to play. She knew she had to find the strings, had to sever the connection, if she had any hope of escaping this nightmare. She moved towards the walls, her hands trembling, her fingers brushing against the rough surface. The whispers seemed to vibrate against her skin, the voices growing louder, more desperate. She grabbed a knife from the chest, her hands shaking as she pressed the blade to the wall, the whispers reaching a fever pitch, the voices screaming in her mind. "Cut the strings, Olivia! Cut the strings!" She closed her eyes, her heart pounding, and drove the knife into the wall. The house shuddered, the walls trembling, the floor beneath her feet shifting. The whispers turned into screams, the voices echoing through the attic, through her mind, drowning out everything else. The air grew colder, the shadows swirling around her, twisting, writhing, as if they were alive. She pulled the knife free, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her eyes wide as she watched the wall crack, the plaster crumbling, the darkness seeping out, wrapping around her, pulling her in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The shadows stilled. The air grew quiet, the house falling into an eerie, oppressive silence. Olivia stumbled back, her body trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were gone, the voices silenced, but the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight in her chest. She looked at the wall, her eyes scanning the cracks, the darkness that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. She knew it wasn't over. She had cut one string, but there were more, so many more, and she had to find them all if she had any hope of freeing herself, of freeing Magda, of ending the marionette's game once and for all. She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing, her resolve hardening. She would cut every string. She would end this nightmare, no matter what it took. Chapter 7. The echoing strings. The silence that settled in the attic after Olivia drove the knife into the wall was thick, unnatural, as if even the air itself had paused in anticipation. It pressed on her ears, a suffocating void where no sound dared to tread. Olivia's breath trembled as she leaned against the wall, her fingers clutching the knife so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heartbeat was the only thing that broke the stillness, thudding heavily, a reminder that she was still alive. But for how much longer? That was the question that gnawed at her mind. The wall where she had cut had begun to weep a dark liquid, something viscous and tar-like that pooled slowly at her feet. The knife wound she had made gaped like a mouth, and for a horrifying instant, Olivia imagined it speaking to her, whispering dark promises she could almost hear if she just leaned in closer, if she just gave herself to it. "Cut the strings, Olivia." The whispers were back, no longer faint echoes but a chorus that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. It wasn't the pleading cry of the trapped. Now, it was something more insistent, a cold demand that tightened around her like invisible hands squeezing at her neck. Olivia pushed herself away from the wall, gasping as she stumbled back, her eyes wide as she stared at the dark ichor pooling on the attic floor. The whispers turned to laughter, hollow and mocking, rising from the depths of the walls and from the shadows that writhed along the floorboards. She had thought that cutting the strings would free her, but the laughter told her otherwise. She was only just beginning. She needed to find the other strings, needed to sever each and every one of them if she had any hope of escaping the marionette's grasp. But where were they? How many more were there? And what was holding them in place? These questions swirled in her mind as she stood in the center of the attic, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow that shifted around her. Suddenly she heard a noise below, a creak of a door, followed by a muffled voice. Magda. The voice was familiar, though twisted, as if being filtered through something thick and ancient. Olivia's stomach twisted with both fear and hope. She knew she couldn't leave Magda alone. She had to get to her before the marionette did. She hurried down the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the weight of the dark air. The hallway seemed longer, stretched somehow, as though the house itself had twisted to keep her from reaching Magda. The doors along the hallway opened on their own, revealing darkened rooms that seemed to call to her, each one more sinister than the last. She could feel eyes on her from the shadows, unseen watchers that hungered for her attention, her life. She reached Magda's room, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A chill ran through her, and she paused, her breath catching. Something was behind the door. Something dark. Something alive. She could hear movement inside, the shuffle of feet, the creak of wood. Slowly she turned the doorknob, her heart pounding as she pushed the door open. The room was dim, the only light coming from the grey morning beyond the curtains. Magda sat in her armchair, her head tilted down, her hair falling over her face. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and Olivia's eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, to the marionette. It was there, slumped over, its strings tangled and knotted, its hollow eyes staring at her with that familiar empty gaze. But there was something different now. It was larger, its limbs longer, as though it had grown since she last saw it. The grin carved into its face seemed wider, more sinister, and its head twitched as she stepped into the room. "Magda," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat dry. She took a step closer, her eyes darting between Magda and the puppet. The old woman didn't move, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The marionette's head jerked up, its eyes locking onto Olivia's. It moved, its body twitching, strings pulling taut, as if being lifted by unseen hands. Olivia felt her stomach drop, a wave of nausea washing over her as the marionette took a step towards her. Its movements jerky, unnatural, its limbs almost boneless in the way they twisted. "You want to cut the strings, Olivia?" The voice came from the puppet, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo through the room, bouncing off the walls, vibrating in her bones. It wasn't the voice of a trapped soul. It was something darker, something ancient and mocking. Olivia backed away, her hand trembling as she gripped the knife, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The marionette moved closer, its limbs creaking, its head twitching. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, longer, wrapping around the walls, closing in on her. "You want freedom?" the marionette whispered, its voice soft, almost tender. "You must pay the price." Olivia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight this thing, this darkness that seemed to be a part of the house itself. She looked at Magda, her heart aching as she saw the old woman's frail form, her head still bowed, her body unmoving. "Magda, please," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, help me." Magda stirred, her head lifting slowly, her eyes meeting Olivia's. For a moment, there was something there. Recognition, a flicker of the woman she used to be. But then her gaze shifted, her eyes widening as she looked at the marionette. "The strings," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to sever them. All of them." The marionette laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that filled the room, drowning out everything else. "You think you can sever the strings, child?" it mocked, its grin widening, its eyes glinting with malice. "You are bound, just like her. Just like everyone who has ever stepped foot in this house." Olivia's hands shook, her grip on the knife loosening. She looked at Magda, her heart pounding. She had to try. She had to save Magda, to save herself. She lunged forward, the knife flashing in the dim light as she brought it down on the marionette's strings. The knife sliced through the air, and for a moment, there was silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then the strings snapped, one by one, the sound like gunshots in the quiet room. The marionette's body jerked, its limbs twitching, its head twisting at an unnatural angle. The shadows in the room recoiled, pulling back, the darkness lifting. Olivia gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Magda, hope flaring in her chest as she saw the old woman's eyes clear, her body relaxing, her hands unclenching. But the marionette wasn't done. Its head jerked up, its hollow eyes locking onto Olivia's, its grin widening, splitting its face in two. "You cannot cut all the strings, Olivia," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. You are bound to me, forever. Olivia backed away, her body trembling, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The marionette's body began to crumble, the wood splintering, the strings falling away, but its laughter remained, echoing in the room, in her mind, in her very soul. And as the marionette fell to pieces, as the shadows pulled back, Olivia knew the truth. She was bound. She was a part of this house, a part of the darkness that lived within its walls. And no matter how many strings she cut, no matter how many times she fought, she would never be free. The marionette's laughter faded, leaving only silence. The room was still, the air heavy, the scent of decay thick. Olivia fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. Magda reached out, her frail hand resting on Olivia's shoulder, her touch gentle, comforting. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. I'm so sorry, my dear. Olivia looked up, her eyes meeting Magda's, her heart aching. She knew that Magda couldn't save her. No one could. She was bound to the marionette, to the house, to the darkness that lived within its walls. And as she knelt there, the whispers began again, soft, insistent, echoing in her mind. Play with me, Olivia. Play with me. The game was far from over. Chapter 8. The Bound Spirit. The darkness in the house felt thicker than before, almost suffocating. Every step Olivia took toward the basement felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted her. The whispers seemed to grow louder, crawling into her ears, tangling her thoughts. The marionette had lured her here, but she could feel it. This time, it wasn't just playing. The house was alive with a sinister energy, thrumming with an ancient presence that had been waiting for this moment, perhaps for centuries. She clutched her lantern tightly, the weak light casting shifting, unsettling shadows that danced along the walls. The basement door loomed before her, worn and cracked, and her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She could feel something behind the door, something dark and unrelenting, waiting just beyond her reach. She paused, listening to the stillness, and then she pulled it open. A gust of stale air hit her, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. She descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the steps echoing in the silence, her lantern casting a small pool of light that did little to dispel the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, rising in pitch, twisting into something almost like laughter. As she reached the bottom, Olivia found herself standing in a narrow corridor, the walls lined with strange symbols carved into the stone. They looked ancient, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. Her fingers brushed over one of them, and a chill shot through her, as if the symbol itself were alive, warning her to turn back. The hallway led her to a large, cold room, where the air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her with an almost physical force. In the center of the room stood a crude stone altar, and on it lay the marionette. Its body was twisted, its limbs stretched, and its hollow eyes stared straight at her, gleaming with a sinister intelligence. She felt her blood turn cold as the puppet's head tilted, its wooden jaw moving as if it were speaking, though no sound came. But the whispers filled her mind, piercing through the silence. Olivia, come closer. She hesitated, her heart pounding. She had come here to end this, to sever the strings, but now that she was face to face with the marionette, an overwhelming fear held her in place. It felt as though it were watching her, judging her, as if it knew every dark thought she had ever had. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, alive with shadows that twisted and writhed. The air grew colder, and Olivia could see her breath misting in front of her. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes fixed on the marionette. A soft voice echoed in her mind, deep and twisted, a voice that felt as though it came from some ancient void. You wish to break free, Olivia, it murmured, each word dripping with malice. You think you can sever the strings. She swallowed, her hands shaking. I won't be your puppet, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The marionette's head tilted back, and a hollow laugh filled the room, echoing off the walls, vibrating through her bones. You are bound to me, child. You have always been bound. Her pulse quickened, her grip tightening on the lantern as she looked around the room. She noticed a circle of darkened, blackened symbols surrounding the altar. They looked like markings of containment, ancient symbols meant to keep something trapped. She realized with horror that this room wasn't just a ritual chamber, it was a prison. Olivia stepped forward, feeling an instinctual urge to break the marionette's hold. She took out the knife she had brought, her fingers trembling as she raised it. She focused on the marionette, ignoring the shadows around her, the whispers growing louder. But as she moved closer, the symbols on the walls began to pulse faster, glowing with a sickly, greenish light. The darkness seemed to thicken, swirling around her, pressing in closer. The marionette's head snapped toward her, its hollow eyes boring into her soul. "Do you think a mere blade can break my hold?" it sneered, its voice echoing in her mind. "I am bound to you, Olivia. We are one." She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to push back the fear. "Then I'll tear you apart," she shouted, and brought the knife down. The blade pierced the marionette's chest, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The darkness seemed to recoil, the whispers fading. She thought she'd won. But then, the marionette's mouth twisted into a mocking smile, and an intense, piercing pain shot through her body. She stumbled back, clutching her chest, gasping as an unbearable coldness flooded her veins. The marionette's laughter filled the room, louder than ever, echoing through her mind. "You are bound, Olivia," it hissed, its voice a venomous whisper. "Every string you sever only tightens my hold on you." Olivia fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the coldness spread, paralyzing her limbs. She could feel something wrapping around her, invisible threads weaving through her skin, pulling her closer to the marionette, binding her to it. Her heartbeat slowed, her breath shallow and ragged. She forced herself to look up at the puppet, her eyes filled with defiance. "I won't let you control me," she whispered, her voice weak but determined. The marionette's laughter faded, replaced by a dark, seething rage. "You are nothing but a vessel, Olivia," it sneered. "A vessel for the darkness. You were born to serve me." With the last of her strength, Olivia reached out, her fingers brushing against the symbols on the altar. She could feel their power, the ancient energy they held, and a spark of hope ignited within her. If she could just harness that energy, maybe, just maybe, she could break the marionette's hold. She closed her eyes, focusing on the symbols, willing their power to flow into her. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, pushing back the cold, breaking through the marionette's hold. The darkness recoiled, hissing, as if it were afraid. The marionette let out a furious scream, its body convulsing, its strings writhing as they struggled to maintain their hold on her. But Olivia's strength grew, the warmth spreading, filling her with a sense of purpose, of defiance. "You will not control me," she whispered, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with determination. With a final surge of power, she reached out and pressed her hand against the marionette's chest, her fingers digging into the wood. The symbols on the walls flared with light, illuminating the room, casting the darkness into retreat. The marionette's screams filled the room, its body convulsing, the strings snapping one by one. The darkness writhed, desperate, but Olivia held firm, her resolve unbreakable. The last string snapped, and the marionette's body went limp, its hollow eyes dark, its twisted smile fading. The shadows around her dissolved, the oppressive weight lifting, leaving the room silent. Olivia collapsed to the floor, her body trembling, her breath shallow. She felt weak, drained, but there was a sense of peace, of freedom, that filled her. She had won. She had severed the final string. But as she looked at the marionette's broken body, a faint whisper echoed in her mind. A reminder that, though she had broken free, the darkness was never truly gone. It lingered, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next vessel, the next soul to ensnare. And as she left the basement, her footsteps echoing in the silence, she knew that she would forever be marked by the darkness, by the shadows that had once held her captive. The marionette's curse was broken, but its legacy would live on. Chapter 9. The Haunting Legacy. Olivia staggered back up from the basement, her body feeling heavier with each step, as though an invisible weight pressed down on her shoulders. She had done it. She'd severed the last string, broken the marionette's hold over her. The whispers had fallen silent, and the oppressive darkness that had lingered in the house seemed to retreat into the shadows, watching her but no longer daring to reach out. Yet, as she reached the top of the stairs and turned to close the basement door, she felt a familiar chill. Her victory felt hollow, incomplete, as if the house itself refused to release her entirely. She closed the door slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed the rough wood. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper from the basement, a lingering echo of the marionette's taunts, but she forced herself to ignore it. The house was quiet, too quiet. Every room she passed felt deserted, as though she were the only soul left within its walls. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching across the walls in twisted shapes that seemed to watch her as she moved. She had the unsettling sensation that, despite breaking the curse, the house itself had absorbed a piece of her struggle, feeding off it, growing darker and colder. She found herself drawn to Magda's room, as if some invisible force guided her there. She pushed the door open gently, peering into the dimly lit room where the frail woman sat in her chair by the window, staring out into the bleak landscape. Olivia's heart clenched. Magda looked even more fragile than before, her skin almost translucent, her eyes hollow and distant. "Magda?" Olivia's voice was soft, filled with both sorrow and relief. The old woman's head turned slowly, her gaze settling on Olivia. A faint smile touched her lips, but it was filled with sadness. "You severed the strings," she murmured, her voice as fragile as her appearance. "You did what so many could not." Olivia nodded, moving closer, her footsteps slow and hesitant. "I thought it was over. But why do I still feel it, Magda? The darkness, the weight." Magda's smile faded, and she looked away, her gaze distant once more. "The house has fed on it for centuries. It has seen many souls fall prey to the darkness within, and now it will hold a piece of you, just as it held a piece of me." Olivia's stomach twisted. "Then I'll never be free." Magda closed her eyes, her face etched with sorrow. "The darkness that bound the marionette may be gone, but the house will always remember. It is as much a part of you now as you are a part of it." A sense of despair settled over Olivia, heavy and cold. She had fought so hard, risked everything to sever the strings, only to find that the very walls of the house had absorbed her struggle, claiming it, refusing to let her go entirely. It was as though her fear, her pain, her desperation had been woven into the structure itself, forever marking her presence here. "What do I do?" Olivia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Magda looked at her, a tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. "You leave, my dear. Leave before it takes more of you, before it finds a new way to pull you back." The words struck Olivia like a hammer, and she felt a deep, instinctive urge to run, to leave the house and never look back. But a part of her hesitated, as though some invisible thread still bound her to this place, holding her back. "What about you, Magda?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "You're still here. Are you bound too?" Magda's gaze softened, and she reached out, her frail fingers brushing against Olivia's hand. "I made my peace with the darkness long ago. It will not hold me for much longer." Olivia blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Magda's hand tightened around hers, and for a moment, her gaze held a strange clarity. "The house may remember, but it does not forgive. And when my time comes, I will be free. Just as you will, if you choose to leave now." Olivia nodded slowly, understanding the silent plea in Magda's words. She had a choice, a chance to escape before the house claimed more of her, before the darkness found a way to pull her back into its grasp. She could leave, walk out of this cursed place, and perhaps in time, the memory of it would fade. But as she turned to leave, a chill ran down her spine, and she hesitated, her gaze drawn to the mirror on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something different, something unsettling in the way her eyes looked back at her. They seemed darker, almost hollow, as though a part of her soul had been drained. She took a step closer to the mirror, her heart pounding, her hand reaching out to touch the glass. The reflection shifted, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she saw herself as a puppet. Strings hanging from her wrists, her eyes empty, her face twisted into a hollow smile. She jerked back, her breath coming in short gasps, her pulse racing. She blinked, and the reflection was normal again, her own terrified face staring back at her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady herself. "Leave, Olivia." Magda's voice echoed from behind her, gentle but firm. "Leave before it's too late." Olivia nodded, her resolve hardening. She turned away from the mirror, from the shadows, from the weight that seemed to press down on her with every step. She walked toward the door, her footsteps growing quicker, her heart pounding as she approached the front entrance. The house felt colder, emptier, as if it knew she was leaving, as if it mourned the loss of its latest captive. The walls seemed to watch her, the shadows stretching across the floor, reaching out as though to pull her back. She ignored them, forcing herself to keep moving, to focus on the door ahead. As she reached for the doorknob, a faint whisper filled her mind, a voice soft and chilling, filled with a familiar malice. "You cannot escape, Olivia. You are bound to us." Her hand froze, her pulse quickening as the darkness pressed in around her, the air growing thick, suffocating. She felt the weight of the marionette's gaze, felt the invisible strings tightening around her, pulling her back, refusing to let her go. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with defiance. "I won't be your puppet." With a surge of strength, she wrenched the door open, stepping out into the cold night air. The chill was sharp, biting, but it was real, and she took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders as she stepped away from the house. She didn't look back, didn't allow herself to glance at the windows or the shadows lurking within. She walked down the path, her steps quick and steady, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. The whispers faded as she moved further from the house, the weight lifting from her chest, the darkness loosening its hold. She could still feel it, a faint pull in the back of her mind, but it grew weaker with each step, until finally, it was nothing more than a distant memory. She reached the edge of the property, her heart pounding as she looked back one last time. The house loomed in the darkness, silent and still, its windows like empty eyes watching her leave. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a twisted shape with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. But she blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the shadows behind. She turned away, her steps quickening as she walked down the road, her heart racing, her mind filled with the echoes of the house's haunting presence. She had escaped, but she knew that part of her would always be bound to that place, a fragment of her soul left behind in the shadows. She would carry the weight of it forever, the memory of the darkness that had tried to claim her, the whispers that had haunted her every step. But she was free, and as she walked into the cold, empty night, she knew that, whatever lay ahead, she would never look back. Chapter 10. Shadows that never fade. The night air was bitterly cold as Olivia walked away from the mansion, her breath clouding in front of her in soft, wispy puffs. She had escaped, severed the strings, and the darkness no longer wrapped around her so tightly, yet each step felt heavier than the last. The memories of the marionette, its hollow eyes, the whispers in the walls, they clung to her, lingering like an unwanted shadow. She reached the edge of the property and finally stopped to catch her breath. The mansion loomed behind her, dark and silent, its windows like watchful eyes following her every movement. She fought the urge to glance back but failed, her gaze drawn to the eerie silhouette of the house against the moonlit sky. The structure seemed almost alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. Olivia turned away, forcing herself to move forward, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoing in the stillness. She told herself it was over, that she'd escaped, but an unsettling feeling grew within her. She couldn't shake the sense that something was watching her from the darkness, something that wasn't quite ready to let her go. As she walked, she became aware of a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest, but the whisper followed her, growing louder with each step. "Olivia!" The sound of her name sent a chill down her spine. She stopped, clenching her fists, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. But the whispers continued, more insistent now, slipping through the silence like tendrils of fog wrapping around her mind. "Play with me." Her pulse raced, a feeling of dread creeping over her. She had heard that voice before. It was the Marionette, the cursed spirit she had tried so desperately to escape. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. She had severed the strings, had freed herself. It couldn't still have a hold on her, could it? A faint rustling in the trees nearby made her jump. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the stillness of the night, the soft sighing of the wind through the branches. The whispers quieted, but an unease lingered, settling deep within her chest. She shook her head, trying to dispel the feeling, but the memory of the Marionette's hollow gaze was burned into her mind, haunting her every thought. Hours passed as she continued her journey, the road winding through fields and dark woods. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look back, though the sensation of being followed clung to her, gnawing at her resolve. Finally, she saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Relief flooded her, and she quickened her pace, her exhaustion fading in the warmth of hope. She needed people, light, normalcy, anything that could anchor her to reality, to prove that she was truly free. As she entered the town, the comforting sounds of life washed over her. Laughter from a nearby bar, the hum of distant cars, the glow of streetlights casting warm pools of light on the pavement. She let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension begin to ease. She found a small inn on the edge of town and checked in, the friendly innkeeper offering her a sympathetic smile as he handed her a key. "You look like you've been through quite an ordeal," he said kindly. "Get some rest. You'll feel better in the morning." Olivia managed a weak smile, nodding as she made her way up the narrow staircase to her room. She closed the door behind her, locking it before leaning back against the wall, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The room was small but cozy, with a single bed, a chair by the window, and a mirror on the wall. She dropped her bag by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her body aching, her mind exhausted. But as she glanced at the mirror, a chill washed over her. She could see her reflection, pale and weary, her eyes wide with the lingering fear that refused to leave her. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was a faint shape, a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Olivia's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there, only the shadows, still and silent. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. It was just her imagination, she told herself, a remnant of the terror she had endured. She turned back to the mirror, forcing herself to face her reflection, but the figure was still there, closer now, its eyes fixed on hers, empty and dark, its smile widening as it watched her. She stumbled back, her hand clamping over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her mind reeled, desperate to understand, to explain. But there was no explanation, no logic that could dispel the horror filling her heart. A whisper filled the room, soft and mocking. "You thought you could escape, Olivia." She shook her head, backing away, her eyes wide with terror. "No! No, I severed the strings. I'm free." The Marionette's laughter echoed in her mind, a hollow, soulless sound that sent shivers down her spine. "The strings are not so easily cut. You are bound to me, Olivia, forever." She collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling, her mind unraveling as the whispers grew louder, filling the room, filling her mind, wrapping around her like chains. "You are mine." The room spun, her vision blurring as the darkness closed in, swallowing her, pulling her back into the shadows. She could feel the strings tightening around her, invisible threads binding her to the Marionette, to the darkness, to the house she thought she had left behind. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her own reflection in the mirror, her face twisted into a hollow, empty smile, her eyes as dark and soulless as the Marionette's. The innkeeper found her the next morning, lying motionless on the bed, her eyes open and unseeing, her face pale and expressionless. He shook his head, muttering a prayer under his breath before closing her eyes. covering her with a blanket and leaving the room. But as he turned to leave, he paused, his gaze drawn to the mirror on the wall. He could have sworn he saw something, a faint shape, a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, watching him from the shadows. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, and left the room, closing the door behind him. But the shadow remained, lingering in the mirror, waiting, watching, its hollow eyes fixed on the door, a silent promise of the darkness yet to come.